In Sterling and Associates' mahogany-lined boardroom, a young woman from Ohio was about to deliver what should have been her career-defining presentation. What started as a routine quarterly analysis took a shocking turn when she came face-to-face with the cruel reality of Manhattan's financial elite. Alexandra Catherine Morrison wasn't your typical Wall Street analyst. For 6 months, she had spent sleepless nights perfecting her innovative cost reduction strategy, known for her methodical precision and summa cum laude brilliance from Ohio State. When she encountered Richard Wellington Hayes III's public humiliation dismissing her work as mere public school arithmetic, she had no idea she was walking into a defining moment that would reshape her entire existence. Alexandra's controlled composure masked a burning rage that would lead to the most calculated campaign of professional revenge in Sterling and Associates history. What began as workplace discrimination would become a 5-year masterclass in strategic destruction. The prestigious financial firm would never be the same after the day their former victim became the architect of their tormentor's downfall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra for you. The mahogany conference table stretched before Alexandra Morrison like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the morning light that streamed through Sterling and Associates' floor-to-ceiling windows. From the 42nd floor, Manhattan spread below in all its intimidating glory, a city of dreams and broken aspirations, where fortunes were made and lost with the click of a mouse. Alex adjusted her blazer, the navy fabric chosen carefully to project competence without ostentation. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights perfecting her presentation, running the numbers until her eyes burned and her fingers cramped from typing. This was her moment. 6 months of meticulous analysis, of staying late while her colleagues attended networking events she couldn't afford, of proving herself worthy of a seat at this very table. The quarterly portfolio performance analysis she began, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest, reveals several key inefficiencies that, when addressed through strategic reallocation, could yield an additional 14% return on our mid-cap investment. The slides changed with practiced precision. Charts and graphs painted a story of missed opportunities and untapped potential. Alex had dissected every position, analyzed every sector, cross-referenced performance metrics with market volatility indices until patterns emerged that others had overlooked. By implementing a systematic approach to position sizing based on risk-adjusted momentum indicators, she continued, warming to her subject, we can reduce overall portfolio volatility by 18% while simultaneously increasing alpha generation. Board members leaned forward. James Hayes Sr., the silver-haired patriarch whose family money had helped build Sterling and Associates from the ground up, nodded approvingly. Margaret Thornton, the CEO whose sharp eyes missed nothing, made notes on her tablet with quick, efficient strokes. Alex felt a surge of vindication. The numbers didn't lie. Merit spoke louder than pedigree. Her Ohio State finance degree might not carry the same weight as an Ivy League diploma, but her analysis was flawless. The projected cost savings, she said, clicking to her final slide, amount to approximately $3 million annually, with implementation costs of less than $400,000. The ROI speaks for itself. Silence settled over the room like morning mist. Alex could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 11 pairs of eyes evaluating her work, her potential, her worthiness to sit among Manhattan's financial elite. Then Richard Wellington Hayes III cleared his throat. Well, he said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted his place at any table, that's certainly ambitious. He leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth that didn't reach his eye. Though I have to wonder if perhaps we're putting a bit too much faith in what amounts to, essentially, public school arithmetic. The words hit Alex like a physical blow. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard continued, his tone conversational, almost friendly. Don't get me wrong, Alexandra's enthusiasm is admirable. It really is, but when we're talking about managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps we need to consider the sophistication of the analysis. He gestured languidly at her presentation. I mean, anyone can run a few correlations through Excel, but understanding the nuanced interplay of market dynamics requires a certain level of institutional education. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, a few, Alex noticed with sinking horror, nodded almost imperceptibly. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with state schools, Richard said, his Harvard class ring catching the light as he gestured. They serve their purpose, but when fiduciary responsibility is at stake, when we're stewards of our clients' wealth, shouldn't we be applying the kind of rigorous analytical framework that comes from, well, a more comprehensive educational foundation? Alex felt heat creep up her neck, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Hold your head high, sweetheart. Nobody can make you feel small, unless you let them. The methodology is sound, she said quietly, proud that her voice didn't shake. The data supports the conclusions regardless of where the analysis was conducted. Richard's smile widened. Of course it does. I'm sure it's perfectly adequate for what it is, but adequacy isn't excellence, is it? When James, he nodded to Hayes, built his fortune, he didn't settle for adequate. When Margaret transformed this firm into what it is today, she didn't accept good enough. Margaret Thornton's pen had stopped moving. She watched the exchange with the intensity of a hawk studying prey, but her expression remained unreadable. Perhaps, Richard continued, we should table this for now. Give me some time to review the work with a more experienced eye. Apply some of the analytical rigor we learned at Cambridge, at Wharton, at Harvard Business School. See if we can't elevate this to the level of sophistication our clients deserve. The dismissal was complete. Alex's 6 months of work, her innovative approach to portfolio optimization, her sleepless nights and meticulous research, all reduced to public school arithmetic that required the blessing of an Ivy League degree to be worthy of consideration. She gathered her materials with hands that remained perfectly steady, even as her mind reeled. The boardroom had become a courtroom, and the verdict was clear. Her credentials weren't pedigreed enough, her background not refined enough, her very presence not quite legitimate enough for Sterling and Associates' rarefied atmosphere. Thank you, Alexandra, Margaret Thornton said finally, her voice neutral. We'll take your recommendations under advisement. As Alex stood to leave, she caught Richard's eye. He winked. Actually winked. As if they were sharing some private joke. As if her humiliation was amusing rather than devastating. The walk to the elevator stretched like a gauntlet. Behind her, conversation resumed in low murmurs. She caught fragments overreach, knows her place now, promising but needs season. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, sealing her into blessed solitude. Only then did Alex allow herself to breathe, to feel the full weight of what had just happened. Her reflection stared back from the polished steel doors. A young woman in a carefully chosen blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, her expression composed despite the storm raging beneath. But something had changed in those dark eyes. The naive optimism that had carried her from Akron to Columbus to New York was gone, burned away by the casual cruelty of inherited privilege. In its place sat something harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. Richard Wellington Hayes III had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd shown Alex exactly how the game was played, revealed the rules that governed his world of quiet discrimination and polite devastation. He demonstrated that merit was secondary to pedigree, that excellence could be dismissed with a smile and a reference to the right school. But he'd also underestimated her completely. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Alex was already planning. Richard thought he'd put her in her place, reminded her of the natural order of things. What he'd actually done was declare war on someone with nothing left to lose, and everything to prove. The doors opened onto Sterling and Associates' marble lobby, where young analysts in expensive suits hurried past carrying the hopes and dreams of 1,000 clients. Alex stepped out into the current of ambition and desperation, her mind already calculating angles, identifying pressure points, mapping the 5-year journey that would end with Richard Wellington Hayes III, learning exactly what public school arithmetic could accomplish when wielded by someone with perfect clarity of purpose. The game was on. The elevator doors had barely closed when Alex felt the tremor in her hands begin. By the time she reached the lobby, Her carefully constructed composure was fracturing like ice under pressure. She moved through the marble expanse with measured steps, nodding to the security guard who'd greeted her cheerfully that morning when the world still made sense. The subway ride to Queens blurred past in a haze of fluorescent lights and grinding metal. Alex stared at her reflection in the window, seeing not the confident analyst who'd walked into Sterling and Associates that morning, but a young woman whose dreams had been casually dismantled with a few well-placed words. Her studio apartment welcomed her with its familiar shabbiness, second-hand furniture, a kitchen table that served as both dining area and home office, walls thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the plaster. The contrast with Sterling and Associates' opulent boardroom couldn't have been starker. Alex dropped her bag beside the door and sank onto her couch, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The humiliation burned through her chest like acid, but beneath it something else was growing, something that felt like molten steel. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "How did the big presentation go, sweetheart? I've been thinking about you all day." Alex stared at the screen, her throat tight. How could she explain that 6 months of work had been dismissed as public school arithmetic? How could she tell Catherine Morrison, who'd worked double shifts at the textile factory to pay for Alex's textbooks, that her daughter's education wasn't good enough for Manhattan's elite? She dialed her mother's number. "Alex." Catherine's voice was warm with anticipation. "Tell me everything. Did they love your presentation?" It went, "Well," Alex began, then stopped. The lie felt like sawdust in her mouth. "Honey, you sound upset." The simple concern in her mother's voice broke something loose inside Alex. The story poured out, Richard's casual cruelty, the board's uncomfortable silence, the way her months of meticulous work had been reduced to a punchline about state school inadequacy. Catherine listened without interruption, and when Alex finished, silence stretched between them for a long moment. "Baby," her mother said finally, her voice carrying the weight of her own experiences with discrimination. "Some people think where you come from determines where you can go. They're wrong, but they're not going to make it easy for you to prove it." "Maybe they're right," Alex whispered. "Maybe I don't belong here." Alexandra Catherine Morrison. Her mother's voice turned stern. "You earned every grade, every honor, every opportunity that brought you to that room. You graduated summa cum laude from a respected university. You've got more intelligence in your little finger than most of those people have in their whole bodies. But they have connections. They have legacy admissions and family money, and you have something they don't." Catherine interrupted. "You have hunger. You have the knowledge of what it's like to work for everything you've got. They think that's a weakness, but it's your strength." After they hung up, Alex sat in the growing darkness of her apartment, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She thought about the factory where Catherine had spent 30 years, the overtime shifts that had paid for Alex's college applications, the way her mother's hands had grown rough from years of handling industrial thread. Richard Wellington Hayes III had never worked a day in his life the way Catherine Morrison worked every day. He'd inherited his position, his connections, his sense of entitlement, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd shown Alex exactly how vulnerable he was. The next morning, Alex arrived at Sterling and Associates with a different energy. She'd spent the night researching, and what she'd found was illuminating. Richard's Harvard MBA might have impressed the board, but his actual performance metrics told a different story. His portfolios consistently underperformed market benchmarks. His client retention rates were below company averages. His supposed expertise was built on nothing more substantial than his family name and his ability to speak with authority about topics he barely understood. She found Jonathan Mitchell in his office, reviewing quarterly reports with the methodical precision that had made him one of Sterling's most respected senior VPs. Jonathan had started as a junior analyst 15 years ago, working his way up from a background not unlike Alex's own. Alex knocked on his open door. "Do you have a few minutes?" He looked up, his expression immediately concerned. "Of course, come in." Close the door. Jonathan Mitchell was the kind of man who noticed things. The slight tension in a colleague's shoulders, the way someone's voice changed when they were struggling. He'd built his career on understanding people as much as understanding markets. "I heard about yesterday," he said gently. Richard's little performance. Alex felt heat rise in her cheeks. The whole company knows. The whole company knows. Richard's an ass. Jonathan said bluntly. What happened to you wasn't about your work, Alex. It was about his insecurity. His insecurity. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her with those patient eyes that had seen too many talented people destroyed by office politics. Richard's been here 3 years. In that time, he's lost 2 major clients, his returns have been consistently mediocre, and his team turnover rate is the highest in the company. Then you show up with 6 months of work that demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. But the board heard him dismiss valid analysis because it threatened his position. Margaret Thornton doesn't miss things like that. Alex absorbed this information, feeling something shift inside her chest. What should I do? Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. You could keep your head down, do your job, wait for Richard to make a big enough mistake that he removes himself from the equation, play it safe, or you could decide that Richard Wellington Hayes III isn't going to define your career. You could outwork him, outthink him, and outperform him until the board has no choice but to recognize who's actually bringing value to this company. That evening, Alex spread her files across her kitchen table and began to build something new. Not just a presentation, but a strategy. She researched Richard's background, his family connections, his educational record. She studied the board members, their investment philosophies, their decision-making patterns. She began to see the chessboard clearly for the first time. Richard thought he'd checkmated her in one move, but he'd actually revealed the positions of all his pieces. He'd shown her exactly how the game was played in his world of inherited privilege and casual cruelty. But Alex had learned a different kind of game growing up. She'd learned patience from her mother, who'd worked double shifts for years without complaint. She'd learned strategic thinking from fighting for every scholarship, every opportunity, every chance to prove herself. She'd learned that when the system was rigged against you, you didn't just play the game, you changed it. As midnight approached, Alex opened a new document on her laptop and began to type. At the top of the page, she wrote, 5-year strategic plan. The systematic dismantling of Richard Wellington Hayes III. She was done being a victim. She was done accepting that her background made her lesser than men like Richard. She was done believing that the game was rigged in their favor. It was time to teach them that they'd underestimated the wrong woman. The war had begun. 6 months after the humiliation, Alex Morrison had become a different creature entirely. She arrived at Sterling & Associates each morning at 6:30 a.m., 90 minutes before anyone else, using the quiet time to review market data and prepare for the day's battle. Her cubicle had transformed into a command center, organized with military precision. The change hadn't gone unnoticed. Where once she'd been simply another junior analyst, now colleagues sought her insights on portfolio optimization. Her quarterly reports had become models of analytical rigor that other departments requested to review. But more importantly, she'd begun to understand the invisible architecture of power that governed Sterling & Associates. The Autumn Charity Gala was her first real test. The Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendor provided the backdrop for Manhattan's financial elite to network under the pretense of philanthropy. Alex had spent 2 weeks' salary on a black dress that whispered rather than shouted, studying fashion magazines to understand the subtle signals that separated old money from new. She positioned herself near the bar, observing the intricate dance of influence and access. Board members moved through the crowd like planets with their own gravitational fields, drawing lesser executives into their orbits. And there, holding court near the ancient temple, was James Hayes Sr., Richard's father. Commanded attention effortlessly. At 72, he possessed the kind of gravitas that came from decades of moving millions with a phone call. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tuxedo impeccable, his manner suggesting someone accustomed to deference. Hayes, Alex approached with the confidence she'd spent months perfecting. Alexandra Morrison, junior analyst on your son's team, I wanted to thank you for your insights during the Q2 strategic review. James Hayes turned, his pale blue eyes appraising her with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating potential investments. Ms. Morrison, your portfolio rebalancing recommendations were noteworthy. Thank you, sir. I've been studying your approach to sector rotation during the '08 crisis. The way you anticipated the banking sector consolidation was masterful. Something flickered in the older man's expression. Surprise, perhaps, that someone had done their homework. You've read my congressional testimony several times. Your prediction about derivative exposure was prescient. I've been wondering if similar patterns might emerge in the current environment. They talked for 20 minutes about market dynamics, regulatory changes, and investment philosophy. Alex had prepared for this conversation like studying for a final exam, but she discovered that James Hayes Sr. was genuinely brilliant in ways his son had never inherited. You know, he said as the conversation wound down, Richard mentioned he's been mentoring some promising young talent. It's good to see the next generation thinking strategically. Alex smiled, filing away the implication that Richard had claimed credit for her development. He's been very supportive of my work. Across the room, she spotted Margaret Thornton deep in conversation with Thomas Sterling, the progressive heir apparent, whose reformist ideas were gradually reshaping company culture. Alex had read every interview Thomas had given, studied his Harvard Business Review articles about eliminating institutional bias in financial services. Excuse me, Mr. Hayes. I should pay my respects to Ms. Thornton. She navigated through the crowd with purpose, timing her approach to catch Margaret between conversations. The CEO's reputation for cutting through corporate nonsense was legendary, but Alex had noticed something others missed. Margaret's background wasn't so different from her own. Ms. Thornton. Alex extended her hand. Alexandra Morrison, I wanted to thank you for implementing the mentorship program for first-generation professionals. Margaret's handshake was firm, her gray eyes sharp. Ms. Morrison, I remember your presentation from several months ago. Interesting analysis on portfolio optimization. I've been refining the methodology based on feedback from the board. The results have been encouraging. I'm sure they have. Margaret's tone was neutral, but Alex sensed evaluation in the brief pause. Walk with me. He moved toward the quieter galleries, away from the networking clusters. Margaret's heels clicked against marble floors as they passed Egyptian artifacts and medieval armor. How are you finding the culture at Sterling & Associates? Margaret asked without preamble. The question felt loaded with potential landmines. Alex chose her words carefully. It's been educational. I'm learning that excellent analysis is just the beginning. Understanding the broader context, the political dynamics, the relationships, that's what transforms good work into actionable strategy. Diplomatic answer. Margaret stopped in front of a Roman statue, its marble surface worn smooth by centuries. I built this company from nothing. Morrison started as a secretary who convinced her boss to let her analyze his portfolio. Worked weekends for 3 years before anyone took me seriously. The admission hung between them like a bridge. Alex recognized the offer being made, not mentorship exactly, but acknowledgement of shared experience. The work speaks for itself, Alex said carefully. But knowing how to make sure it's heard, that's the challenge. Margaret smiled slightly. Indeed. Keep doing excellent work, Ms. Morris. Excellence has a way of demanding recognition. As the evening progressed, Alex catalogued observations like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. She watched Richard work the room with practiced charm, his Harvard connections providing easy entree to conversations that had been closed to her. But she also noticed the subtle signs of his limitations, the way older investors' eyes glazed over when he spoke, the polite but dismissive responses to his market predictions. The real revelation came when she overheard Victoria Richardson, Sterling's head of human resources, discussing upcoming organizational changes with 2 other executives. Thomas is pushing for more diversity in senior leadership. Victoria was saying, he's got Margaret's ear on this initiative to identify high-potential talent from non-traditional backgrounds. Risky. One of the men replied, cultural fit matters in client relationships. Maybe, Victoria conceded, but the metrics don't lie. Some of our most innovative thinking is coming from people who didn't grow up in this world. Alex filed this information away, Understanding that Victoria's calculating nature made her both valuable and dangerous, the HR director's loyalties followed power, which made her predictable but not trustworthy. Later that evening, Alex sat in her queen's apartment, surrounded by notes and observations from the gala. She'd spent months building a detailed psychological profile of each key player, understanding their motivations, their pressure points, their decision-making patterns. Richard's weakness was becoming clear. His privileged background had made him lazy, complacent in ways that would eventually become his downfall. He'd coasted on connections and inherited credibility, never developing the deep analytical skills that sustained long-term success. But Alex's real breakthrough came when she began analyzing Richard's portfolio performance data, information that took weeks to compile from various internal systems. The numbers revealed a pattern of mediocrity masked by favorable market conditions. His returns consistently lagged benchmarks, his risk management was sloppy, and his client retention numbers were declining. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The beautiful part was that Richard seemed unaware of his own weaknesses. He'd grown so accustomed to having his mediocrity overlooked that he'd stopped trying to improve. His Harvard MBA had become a shield that protected him from scrutiny rather than a foundation for excellence. Alex opened her laptop and began documenting her strategy. She would need to be patient, methodical, absolutely precise in her approach. Every move would have to serve multiple purposes, advancing her own career while systematically exposing Richard's incompetence. The first phase would focus on consistently outperforming Richard's results, while maintaining the appearance of respectful subordination. She would volunteer for high-visibility projects, build relationships with key decision-makers, and slowly establish herself as the obvious alternative to Richard's failing leadership. The second phase would involve more active measures, strategic information sharing that highlighted Richard's mistakes, carefully orchestrated situations that revealed his lack of substance, alliance building with other executives who'd grown tired of his arrogance. The final phase would be the kill shot, a comprehensive demonstration of Richard's unfitness for leadership delivered in a way that made his removal inevitable. Alex smiled as she typed, thinking about the conversation with James Hayes. Richard's own father had been more impressed by her analytical capabilities than by anything his son had accomplished recently. The irony was perfect. She would destroy Richard using the very standards of excellence that his family claimed to value. 5 years seemed like a reasonable timeline, long enough to build unassailable credibility, short enough to maintain focus and intensity. By the time she was finished, Richard Wellington Hayes III would understand exactly what public school arithmetic could accomplish when wielded by someone with perfect clarity of purpose. The game was entering its second phase. 2 years of systematic excellence had paid off in ways Alex hadn't dared hope for when she'd first outlined her strategy. The promotion to senior analyst came with a corner office, a substantial salary increase, and most importantly, the kind of visibility that made her previous cubicle existence feel like ancient history. The announcement had been made in Sterling and Associates' main conference room, with Margaret Thornton personally delivering the news to a gathering of senior staff. Alex had maintained perfect composure as congratulations flowed around her, but she'd caught Richard's expression in her peripheral vision, a flash of disbelief followed by barely controlled rage. Alexandra's innovative approach to risk-adjusted portfolio management has generated exceptional returns for our clients, Margaret had said, her voice carrying the authority that made lesser executives straighten their spine. Her promotion reflects not just her individual contributions, but the kind of analytical rigor we value at Sterling and Associates. The words had felt like vindication, but Alex knew better than to celebrate prematurely. This was merely the first checkpoint in a much longer journey. Now, settling into her new office with its view of the Hudson River, Alex felt the intoxicating rush of real power. The space itself sent messages, mahogany furniture that whispered of permanence, diplomas and certifications that declared expertise, the kind of territorial markers that established hierarchy in corporate ecosystems. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Rebecca Foster entered with the eager nervousness of someone still learning to navigate Sterling and Associates' complex social dynamic. At 24, Rebecca reminded Alex of herself 2 years ago, brilliant, ambitious, but carrying the subtle insecurity that came from being a first-generation professional in a world of inherited privilege. "Miss Morrison, I'm Rebecca Foster, the new junior analyst. I was hoping we could discuss the Henderson portfolio analysis." Alex studied the young woman, noting the carefully chosen but slightly outdated business attire, the way Rebecca's eyes catalogued the office's status symbol. Another state school graduate, another outsider trying to prove her worth in Manhattan's financial elite. "Sit down, Rebecca, and please call me Alex." The conversation that followed revealed exactly what Alex had expected: exceptional analytical skills wrapped in self-doubt, innovative thinking constrained by fear of making mistakes. Rebecca had the same hunger that had driven Alex's own climb, but she lacked the strategic thinking that separated survival from success. "Your analysis of the Henderson portfolio is solid," Alex said, reviewing Rebecca's work on her tablet, "but you're being too conservative in your recommendations. The risk-adjusted returns support a more aggressive rebalancing strategy." "I was concerned about volatility," Rebecca admitted. "Mr. Hayes suggested I should be more cautious with client assets." Alex felt a familiar surge of anger. Richard was still playing the same games, still using his position to undermine confidence and maintain control, but now she had the authority to fight back. "Richard's approach to risk management is traditional," Alex said carefully, "but in this market environment, excessive caution can be its own form of risk. Let me show you something." For the next hour, Alex walked Rebecca through the sophisticated modeling techniques she'd developed, the pattern recognition systems that had made her portfolios consistently outperform benchmarks. It felt strange to be teaching rather than learning, but also profoundly satisfying. "I want you to revise your Henderson recommendations," Alex said as their meeting concluded. "Use the framework we just discussed. And Rebecca, don't let anyone convince you that your educational background makes your insights less valuable. The work speaks for itself." The young woman's face lit up with the kind of gratitude that made Alex remember why she'd started this journey. It wasn't just about destroying Richard, it was about proving that merit could triumph over privilege, that excellence could overcome entitlement. Later that afternoon, Alex attended her first senior staff meeting as a participant rather than a subordinate. The dynamics were fascinating to observe from her new position. Victoria Richardson, the calculating HR director, made a point of welcoming Alex to the group while subtly distancing herself from Richard's faction. Thomas Sterling, the progressive heir apparent, seemed genuinely pleased by her promotion and made several references to her fresh perspective. But it was Richard's behavior that provided the most revealing insights. His responses to strategic questions lacked the depth that Alex had learned to expect from senior leadership. His market predictions were superficial, his risk assessments simplistic. Without his Harvard credentials to shield him, his actual capabilities were becoming increasingly apparent. "Richard," Margaret Thornton said during a discussion of portfolio diversification, "what's your take on emerging market exposure in the current environment?" Richard's answer was a masterclass in saying nothing while sounding authoritative. He referenced broad market trends, cited conventional wisdom, and arrived at conclusions that any first-year analyst could have reached. But Alex noticed something else. Several board members exchanged glances during his response, the kind of subtle communication that suggested growing skepticism. When Margaret asked for Alex's input on the same question, she was ready with a detailed analysis that she'd been developing for months. Her response demonstrated not just understanding of market dynamics, but the ability to synthesize complex information into actionable strategy. "Interesting perspective," Margaret said when Alex finished. "Could you prepare a more detailed analysis for the board's review?" Alex felt the shift in the room's energy. This wasn't just about her promotion anymore. It was about the beginning of a new power dynamic. She'd moved from being Richard's subordinate to being his competitor, and everyone could sense the change. The meeting ended with project assignments that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Alex found herself leading a team of analysts, managing client relationships, and reporting directly to Margaret Thornton on strategic initiatives. The scope of her responsibilities had expanded exponentially, but so had her opportunities to demonstrate excellence. That evening, Alex called her mother to share the news. Catherine Morrison's pride was audible across the phone line, but there was something else in her voice, a note of concern that Alex had learned to recognize. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," Catherine said. "But don't forget who you are in all this success. Don't let that place change the person I raised." The warning was gentle but pointed. Alex had been so focused on outmaneuvering Richard that she hadn't considered the cost of her transformation. The strategic thinking that had made her promotion possible had also made her more calculating, more willing to manipulate situations for her advantage. "I'm still the same person, Mom," Alex said, but even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. Later that night, she reviewed her expanded strategy documents, updating timelines and objectives based on her new position. The promotion had accelerated her timeline significantly. What she'd thought would take 5 years might be accomplished in 3, if she played her cards correctly. Richard's position was becoming increasingly untenable. He'd lost his most obvious advantage, the authority that came from rank, and now had to compete on merit alone. The comparison wouldn't be flattering for him, but Alex also recognized new challenges. Success brought scrutiny, and scrutiny could reveal the calculating nature of her ascent. She would need to be more careful, more subtle in her approach. The next phase of her strategy would require the kind of political sophistication that she was still learning to master. As she prepared for bed in her now comfortable apartment, another benefit of her promotion, Alex reflected on how far she'd come. 2 years ago, Richard had humiliated her in front of the board, dismissing her work as public school arithmetic. Now she was his equal, in rank and his superior in capability, but this was only the beginning. The real test would come when she had to choose between professional advancement and personal integrity, between the satisfaction of revenge and the possibility of genuine leadership. The game was entering its third phase, and the stakes were higher than ever. The Henderson portfolio crisis hit Sterling and Associates like a market crash in miniature. 48 hours of devastating losses had wiped out 6 months of gains, sending shockwaves through the executive floor and triggering emergency meetings that stretched into the early morning hours. Alex sat in her office at 2:00 a.m., surrounded by printouts and analysis reports, her fingers dancing across calculator keys with practiced precision. The patterns were becoming clear, a perfect storm of currency fluctuations, regulatory changes, and sector-specific volatility that had caught the entire firm off guard. Except it hadn't caught everyone off guard. She'd been tracking the indicators for weeks, building models that predicted exactly this kind of cascade failure. Her early warning systems had been flashing red since the beginning of the month, but she'd been careful about how she shared that information. Strategic patience, she'd learned, was often more valuable than immediate action. A knock at her door interrupted her analysis. David Chen stood in the doorway, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the crisis response. His tie was loose, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and there was a intensity in his dark eyes that made Alex's pulse quicken. "Still here?" he asked, stepping into her office. "I thought you might have gone home hours ago." "Couldn't sleep," Alex replied, which was true enough. "Wanted to understand what happened." David moved to her desk, studying the charts and projections she'd spread across its surface. His proximity was distracting in ways that had nothing to do with their professional relationship. Over the past year, their collaboration had evolved from mutual respect to something more complex, a connection that felt both natural and dangerous. "This is remarkable work," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "You've mapped the entire cascade sequence." "It was predictable," Alex said, then caught herself. "I mean, the indicators were there if you knew what to look for." David's expression sharpened. "You saw this coming?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Alex had been careful to maintain her cover as a talented but conventional analyst. But David's intelligence made him uniquely dangerous to her carefully constructed facade. "I had concerns," she admitted, "but you know how it is. Junior analysts don't exactly drive strategic decisions." "You're not junior anymore," David pointed out. "And Margaret Thornton has been asking for your input on the response strategy." The truth was more complex than Alex could admit. She'd seen the crisis coming and had calculated that allowing it to unfold would serve her broader objective. Richard's portfolios were disproportionately exposed to the sectors that had collapsed, while her own risk management strategies had protected her clients from the worst of the damage. "What's your assessment of the response so far?" David asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. Alex chose her words carefully. "I think we're focusing too much on damage control, instead of understanding the systematic issues that created this vulnerability. Such as risk management failures, inadequate diversification, over-reliance on conventional wisdom instead of deeper analytical modeling." Each criticism was aimed directly at Richard's approach, though she didn't mention him by name. David leaned back, studying her with an expression that was part admiration, part concern. "You're talking about fundamental changes to how we approach portfolio management. I'm talking about the difference between reactive and proactive strategy," Alex replied, "between management that anticipates problems and management that simply responds to them." The conversation that followed stretched past Friedrich, ranging from market theory to risk modeling, to the cultural dynamics that had made Sterling and Associates vulnerable to this kind of crisis. Alex found herself sharing insights that she'd kept hidden for months. But David's intellectual curiosity was intoxicating. "You should present this to the board," he said finally. "This level of analysis could reshape our entire approach." "I'm not sure I have the standing." "You have the competence," David interrupted. "And right now, that's what matters most." As he prepared to leave, he paused at her office door. "Alex, for what it's worth, I think you're exactly what this company needs. Someone who sees beyond the traditional approaches." After he left, Alex sat alone in her office, wrestling with emotions she hadn't expected. David's respect felt different from the strategic relationship she'd been building. It was based on genuine admiration for her capabilities, rather than calculation about her usefulness, but she couldn't afford to be distracted by personal connections. The crisis had created exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been positioning herself to explore. The next morning's emergency board meeting was a masterclass in corporate theater. Richard arrived looking haggard, his usual confidence replaced by defensive explanations for why his portfolios had performed so poorly. Victoria Richardson sat with carefully neutral expression, already calculating how to distance herself from the fallout. Margaret Thornton's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade. "I want to understand how we got here, and more importantly, I want to know how we prevent it from happening again." The discussion that followed was painful to watch. Richard's explanations grew increasingly desperate as board members pressed for specific. His risk management protocols were revealed as inadequate, his diversification strategies as fundamentally flawed. "What about proactive measures?" James Hayes Sr. asked, his tone carrying the kind of disappointment that made grown executives squirm. "Were there any early warning indicators we should have recognized?" The question was Alex's cue. She'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, building the foundation for what came next. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd been cultivating. "I've been tracking some concerning patterns in sector correlation that might have predicted this kind of cascade failure." She presented her analysis with surgical precision, demonstrating not just what had happened, but what should have been anticipated. Her models showed the exact sequence of events that had led to the crisis, the risk factors that had been ignored, the diversification strategies that could have minimized the damage. The silence that followed was profound. Alex could see the board members processing the implications that one of their senior analysts had anticipated the crisis, while their senior management had been caught completely off guard. "This is exceptional work," Margaret said finally. "Why wasn't this analysis presented before the crisis?" Alex chose her response carefully. "I shared my concerns through appropriate channels, but I may not have been sufficiently forceful in my presentation." The deflection was perfect, taking responsibility while implying that her warnings had been ignored or dismissed. She could see Richard's face redden as he realized the implication. "Going forward," Margaret continued, "I want Ms. Morrison to lead our risk assessment review. We need to understand how to integrate this kind of analytical rigor into our standard operating procedure." The assignment was everything. Alex had hoped for expanded authority, direct access to senior leadership, and the kind of high-visibility project that could accelerate her ascent. But more importantly, it gave her the perfect platform to demonstrate the contrast between her capabilities and Richard's limitations. As the meeting concluded, Alex caught Jonathan Mitchell's eye. Her mentor's expression was unreadable, but she sensed evaluation in his gaze. Jonathan had been watching her transformation with growing concern, and she wondered if he was beginning to understand the true nature of her strategy. Later that afternoon, David found her in her office, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses in his hand. "I thought we should celebrate," he said, his smile warm but tentative. "Your presentation was remarkable." As they shared the wine, Alex felt the dangerous pull of genuine connection. David's admiration wasn't strategic, it was real, personal, based on his respect for her intelligence and capabilities. It was exactly the kind of authentic relationship that her calculated ascent had made impossible. "David," she said softly, "I need you to know that I'm not always easy to understand." "I'm not looking for easy," he replied, his dark eyes holding hers. "I'm looking for real." The irony was devastating. David thought he was falling for the real Alex Morrison, but she'd been playing a role for so long that she wasn't sure who the real person was anymore. Her entire identity had become wrapped up in her campaign against Richard, her authentic self buried beneath layers of strategic calculation. As David leaned closer, Alex felt herself at a crossroads. She could allow herself to be vulnerable, to let David see the person behind the professional facade, or she could maintain the careful distance that had served her strategy so well. The choice she made would determine not just her relationship with David, but the kind of person she was becoming in her pursuit of revenge. 4 years after Richard's dismissive comments about public school arithmetic, Alex Morrison stood in Margaret Thornton's corner office, looking out over Manhattan's financial district from the 52nd floor. The view was intoxicating, a panorama of power and possibility that had once seemed as distant as the moon. "Regional Director," Margaret said, the words carrying weight that echoed through the mahogany-paneled space. "It's a significant promotion, Alex." The board was unanimous in their support. Alex maintained her composure, but internally she felt the savage satisfaction of a long-term strategy finally bearing fruit. Regional Director meant authority over Richard's division, control of budget allocations, and the kind of institutional power that could make or break career. "I'm honored by the board's confidence," Alex replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Margaret studied her with those sharp gray eyes that had built Sterling and Associates from nothing. "You've earned. Your risk management protocols have become the firm's standard operating procedure. Your portfolio performance has been exceptional, and your leadership during the Henderson crisis demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need." The irony wasn't lost on Alex. The Henderson crisis that had accelerated her rise had been partly engineered by her own strategic patience, allowing Richard's flawed risk management to create the perfect storm that would highlight the contrast between their capabilities. "There will be challenges," Margaret continued. "You'll be managing some executives who have been with the firm longer than you've been in the industry. Some may question your authority initially." "I understand," Alex said, though they both knew exactly which executive Margaret was referring to. The announcement came that afternoon in the main conference room, with senior staff assembled for what Victoria Richardson had billed as a strategic restructuring update. Alex watched faces around the table as Margaret delivered the news, cataloging reactions with the precision that had made her promotion possible. Thomas Sterling beamed with the satisfaction of someone whose diversity initiatives were finally bearing fruit. Jonathan Mitchell nodded approvingly, though Alex caught something more complex in his expression, pride mixed with concern. Victoria Richardson's smile was calculatedly supportive, but Alex could see the HR director already adjusting her allegiances. And Richard's face was a masterpiece of controlled devastation. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his hands gripping his pen with enough force to leave indentation. The man who had once dismissed her work as inadequate now faced the reality of reporting to the woman he'd tried to humiliate. "I know you'll all give Alex the support she needs to succeed in this new role," Margaret said, her tone carrying the kind of authority that made dissent impossible. "The transition will be effective immediately." As the meeting concluded, Alex found herself surrounded by congratulations and well wishes, but her attention was focused on Richard's exit, the way his shoulders set with rigid tension, the forced smile he gave to colleagues, the careful control that suggested barely contained rage. The first test came within hours. Alex had requested a meeting with Richard to discuss the transition of responsibilities, but she'd chosen the timing and location with surgical precision. Her new office, with its view of the Hudson River and its symbols of earned authority, would serve as the perfect backdrop for their role reversal. Richard arrived precisely on time, his appearance as immaculate as ever but his demeanor noticeably different. The casual arrogance that had once defined his interactions with Alex was gone, replaced by the kind of stiff formality that people adopted when they suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory. "Congratulations on your promotion," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, the same chair where she'd once sat as his subordinate, listening to his condescending explanations about how the real world worked. "Thank you," Alex replied, her tone professional but with an undercurrent that both of them recognized. "I wanted to discuss the transition of your portfolio responsibility." The conversation that followed was a carefully choreographed dance of professional courtesy, Ma's king personal vindication. Alex had spent months preparing for this moment, understanding exactly which clients Richard valued most, which projects gave him the greatest satisfaction, which responsibilities fed his sense of importance. "The Morrison account will be transitioning to Jennifer's team," Alex said, referencing Richard's most prestigious client, "and the Sterling Foundation portfolio will move under David's supervision." Each reassignment was a calculated strike, dismantling Richard's power base with surgical precision. She watched his face carefully, noting the micro-expressions that revealed his growing understanding of what was happening. This wasn't just a routine restructuring, it was a systematic dismantling of everything he'd built. "I see," Richard said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "And what responsibilities will remain with my team?" Alex consulted her notes with deliberate slowness. "The Henderson remediation project will stay with you, along with the compliance review protocols. Important work, certainly, but more focused on cleanup than new business development." The message was crystal clear. Richard was being relegated to managing the messes he'd helped create, while the profitable, high-visibility work went to others. It was professional exile disguised as strategic realignment. "Of course," Richard replied, though his knuckles were white where they gripped his portfolio. "Whatever serves the company's interests best." After he left, Alex sat alone in her office, waiting for the satisfaction she'd anticipated for 4 years, but the emotion that came was more complex than simple triumph. She'd imagined this moment countless times, but the reality felt strangely hollow. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Drinks tonight? We should celebrate your promotion properly." The message reminded her of another cost of her ascent. Her relationship with David had grown increasingly complicated as her true nature revealed itself through her strategic maneuvering. He'd begun to sense the calculating intelligence behind her professional success, and it troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. That evening, they met at the same wine bar where they'd shared their first bottle after the Henderson crisis. But the atmosphere was different now, charged with unspoken tensions that had been building for months.
"You did it," David said,
raising his glass in a toast. "Regional director at 31, that's extraordinary."
"It feels surreal,"
Alex admitted, which was partially true. The promotion was real, but the person celebrating it felt like a carefully constructed fiction.
"You..."
David studied her expression, his dark eyes searching for something he couldn't name.
"You've changed."
"Alex. Over the past year especially, you've become more strategic in how you approach everything."
The observation
hit closer to home than she'd expected.
"Is that bad?"
"Not bad," David said carefully, "but sometimes I feel like I'm talking to a chess player instead of a person. Like every conversation is part of some larger game I don't understand." The accusation stung because it was accurate. Alex had become a chess player, moving pieces and calculating outcomes with ruthless precision. But she'd convinced herself that it was necessary, that the system had forced her to adopt its rules in order to succeed. "The system doesn't reward authenticity," Alex said, her voice carrying an edge of defensive. It rewards results. Strategy. The ability to navigate complex political dynamics. I know, David replied, but I also know the person who used to stay late helping Rebecca with her analysis, who called her mother every Sunday, who cried when she thought no one was watching after Richard's attack. That person seemed more. The conversation continued for another hour, but Alex found herself building walls even as David tried to tear them down. She couldn't afford to be vulnerable, not when she was so close to her ultimate objective. Emotional authenticity was a luxury she couldn't afford until Richard Wellington Hayes III was completely neutralized. Later that night, Alex's mother called from Ohio, her voice warm with pride and concern in equal measure.
I'm so proud of you, sweetheart,
Catherine said. Regional Director. Wait until I tell the girls at work.
Thanks,
Mom, Alex replied, but she could hear the distance in her own voice.
Are you happy, Alex? Really happy?
The question caught her off guard. Happiness hadn't been part of her strategic plan. Success, vindication, professional advancement. Those had been her objectives, but happiness seemed like an abstract concept, something that belonged to a different version of herself. I'm successful, Alex said finally. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything Alex couldn't say. How could she explain that she'd sacrificed happiness for justice, authenticity for advancement? How could she tell her mother that the promotion felt like putting on an elaborate costume that was slowly becoming her actual skin? I need to finish what I started, Alex said quietly. What you started, or what someone else started, when they treated you badly. Catherine Morrison had always possessed an uncomfortable ability to see through her daughter's rationalizations. The question forced Alex to confront the possibility that her 5-year campaign might have become something darker than just. After hanging up, Alex stood at her apartment window, looking out over Queens toward Manhattan's gleaming towers. She'd come so far from the cramped studio where she'd plotted her revenge, but the distance felt emotional as much as physical. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Richard's humiliation would deepen as he adjusted to his reduced circumstances. The board would expect her to justify their confidence with exceptional results. And somewhere in the complex web of relationships she'd built, she would have to decide whether the person she'd become was someone she could live with. But tonight, in the quiet of her upgraded apartment, Alex Morrison allowed herself a moment of bitter satisfaction. Richard Wellington Hayes III was learning what it felt like to have his professional fate controlled by someone he'd once dismissed as inferior. The game was entering its final phase, and victory was within reach. The only question was whether it would be worth the price she'd paid to achieve. The evidence arrived in Alex's office on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a junior compliance officer whose nervous demeanor suggested she understood the implications of what she was carrying. A manila folder containing 6 months of transaction records, client communications and trading patterns, that painted a devastating picture of Richard Wellington Hayes III's professional conduct. Alex spread the documents across her conference table, her trained eye immediately recognizing the patterns that spelled career destruction, unauthorized trading in client accounts, positions taken that violated risk parameters. Most damning of all, trades that suggested Richard had been front-running client orders for personal benefit. The smoking gun was buried in the third section, a series of options trades that Richard had made in his personal account, just days before executing large client orders in the same securities. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, the profits too consistent to be luck. How long has this been going on? Alex asked the compliance officer, a young woman named Jennifer who'd worked her way up from the audit department. Based on the patterns, possibly 18 months, Jennifer replied, her voice tight with professional concern. Maybe longer. We only started investigating after the new monitoring protocols flagged some unusual activity. Alex felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. The monitoring protocols Jennifer mentioned were part of the risk management overhaul that Alex had implemented as regional director. She'd designed them to catch exactly this kind of misconduct, but she hadn't expected them to reveal the full extent of Richard's corruption. Have you shared this with anyone else? Alex asked, No, ma'am. Chain of custody procedures require that I report directly to the division head before involving outside parties, which meant Alex now held Richard's professional life in her hand. The evidence was damning enough to end his career, destroy his reputation, and potentially result in criminal charges. It was everything she'd worked toward for 4 years, wrapped in a neat package, and delivered to her desk. But as she studied the documents, Alex found herself thinking about unintended consequences. Richard's trading violations had hurt real people, pension funds, charitable foundations, individual investors who'd trusted Sterling and Associates with their financial future. His corruption had cost clients money while enriching himself, turning the firm into an unwitting accomplice to his greed. That afternoon, Alex made an unexpected decision. Instead of immediately reporting the violations to the SEC or calling an emergency board meeting, she decided to confront Richard directly. She needed to understand the full scope of his misconduct before determining how to proceed. The meeting took place in Richard's office, a space that had been gradually stripped of its most prestigious assignments over the past months. Where once walls had been covered with awards and client testimonials, now there were empty spaces that spoke to a career in decline. Richard looked up as Alex entered, his expression wary. The confident arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by something more guarded, more calculating. He'd learned to be careful around her, though he clearly didn't understand the full extent of his vulnerability. "We need to talk," Alex said, closing the door behind her and taking a seat across from his desk. "About your trading activities." The color drained from Richard's face with the swiftness of a market crash. His hands, which had been casually shuffling papers, went completely still. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, but his voice carried the tremor of someone who knew exactly what was coming. Alex placed a single page of transaction records on his desk, just enough to make her point, without revealing the full extent of her evidence. "Front-running client orders is a federal crime, Richard. The SEC takes it very seriously." Richard stared at the document, his breathing shallow. When he looked up, his face had aged 10 years in the span of 30 seconds. "You don't understand the pressure," he said quietly. "The expectations. My father. The board, everyone assuming I'd naturally excel at this because of my background. But I was never as good as they thought I was. Never as good as—" He gestured vaguely in her direction. "As good as what?" "As someone with a state school education." The question hung between them like an accusation. Richard's face crumpled with something that might have been shame, or relief, or simple exhaustion. "I know how this looks," he continued, "but I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The trades were small, carefully calculated not to impact client returns significantly. Theft is theft, Richard. Whether it's small or large. I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know that now." Alex studied his face, seeing something she hadn't expected. Genuine remorse mixed with devastating fear. This wasn't the arrogant, privileged son who'd humiliated her 4 years ago. This was a broken man who'd finally been forced to confront the gap between his inheritance and his ability. "What happens now?" Richard asked. The question forced Alex to confront the decision she'd been avoiding. She had enough evidence to destroy Richard completely to see him arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned. It would be perfect revenge, the ultimate vindication of her long campaign. But sitting across from him now, seeing the human cost of his downfall, Alex found herself questioning whether complete destruction was justice or simply cruelty. "That depends," she said carefully, "on what you're prepared to do to make this right." That evening, Alex sat in her apartment, reviewing the compliance files while wrestling with emotions she hadn't anticipated. Her phone rang, David's number appearing on the screen, but she let it go to voicemail. She couldn't handle his moral clarity right now, couldn't bear to hear him question the choices she was about to make. Instead, she called Jonathan Mitchell, her original mentor, who'd watched her transformation with growing concern over the past 4 years. "I need to talk to someone," she said when he answered, "about a situation that's complicated." Jonathan agreed to meet her at a quiet restaurant in Midtown, away from the Sterling and Associates ecosystem where every conversation was potentially monitored for political implications. "You look like someone carrying a heavy burden," Jonathan observed, as they settled into a corner booth. Alex found herself telling him everything, not just about Richard's trading violations, but about her 4-year campaign of systematic revenge. The strategic planning, the calculated moves, the patient destruction of Richard's career. Jonathan listened without judgment, his expression growing more concerned as she revealed the full scope of her activities. "You accomplished what you set out to do," he said finally. "Richard is finished, whether through criminal prosecution or professional disgrace. The question is, what kind of person has this campaign made you?" "A successful one," Alex replied, but the words felt hollow. "Success at what cost?" Jonathan asked gently. "You've spent 4 years turning yourself into someone whose primary relationship is with revenge. When did you last have a conversation that wasn't ultimately about advancing your position or undermining Richard's?" The question hit Alex like a physical blow because she couldn't answer. Every relationship, every decision, every moment of the past 4 years had been filtered through her strategic objectives. She'd become a chess player so completely that she'd forgotten how to be a human being. "David loves you," Jonathan continued. "Your mother worries about you. Rebecca looks up to you. But all of those relationships are suffering because you can't let anyone see the real Alex anymore. The strategic Alex has consumed everything else." As Alex walked home through Manhattan's bustling streets, she found herself thinking about unintended consequences. Richard's downfall would satisfy her desire for justice, but it would also devastate his family. James Hayes Sr., despite his disappointment in his son, would be crushed by the public humiliation. Richard's wife and children would suffer for his crimes, and what about herself? She'd achieved everything she'd set out to accomplish, but the victory felt poisonous rather than sweet. She'd become exactly the kind of person she'd originally opposed, someone who used power to destroy rather than build, who valued winning over integrity. Her phone buzzed with another call from David, followed immediately by a text. "Alex, I know something's wrong. Please let me help." For the first time in months, Alex felt the urge to be honest with someone, to drop the strategic mask and admit that she was drowning in the person she'd become. But vulnerability felt dangerous, like a luxury she couldn't afford when she was so close to her ultimate objective. Tomorrow she would have to decide Richard's fate. She could proceed with criminal prosecution, ensuring his complete destruction, or she could find a different path, one that achieved justice without requiring her to become the kind of person who destroyed lives for personal satisfaction. The choice would determine not just Richard's future, but the answer to Jonathan's question about what kind of person her campaign had created. Alex stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, watching the sun set over Manhattan's skyline as she held Richard's fate in her hand. The compliance files lay spread across her desk like evidence in a criminal trial, each document a nail in the coffin of his career. But the decision that should have felt like triumph instead felt like standing at the edge of a moral precipice. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Haven't heard from you in days, sweetheart. Everything okay?" The simple concern in those words made Alex's chest tighten. When had she last had a conversation with Catherine Morrison that wasn't filtered through strategic consideration? When had she last allowed herself to be just a daughter instead of a carefully constructed professional persona? A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Jonathan Mitchell entered, his expression carrying the weight of their conversation from the previous evening. "Have you made your decision?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I know what the right choice is," Alex replied, her voice carrying an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the late hour. "The question is whether I'm still capable of making it." Jonathan studied her with the patience that had made him such an effective mentor. "What do you think the right choice is?" "Professional accountability without personal destruction. Give Richard the chance to resign quietly, make restitution to the affected clients, and leave the industry. Avoid the criminal prosecution that would destroy his family along with him." "That sounds like justice rather than revenge," Jonathan observed. "What's stopping you?" Alex turned from the window to face. 4 years of planning. 4 years of systematic effort to reach exactly this moment. The Richard who humiliated me in front of the board wouldn't have shown mercy if our positions were reversed. But you're not, Richard, Jonathan said quietly. The question is, who is the person you've become? That evening, Alex made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of going home to her apartment, she drove to Queens, to the neighborhood where she'd grown up. To the small house where Catherine Morrison still lived, despite her daughter's offers to help her move somewhere more comfortable. Her mother answered the door with the kind of smile that made Alex remember who she'd been before Sterling and Associates. Before Richard's humiliation, before she'd learned to weaponize her intelligence for personal vendettas. Alex, what a wonderful surprise. Come in. I was just making dinner. The house was exactly as Alex remembered. Modest furniture that had been carefully maintained for decades. Family photos covering every available surface. The kind of warmth that came from genuine love rather than expensive decorating. You look tired, sweetheart, Catherine said as they settled at the kitchen table where Alex had done her homework 20 years earlier. Are you eating enough? Sleeping enough? I'm fine, Mom, Alex began. Then the automatic deflection felt wrong in this place, surrounded by reminders of who she'd been before she'd learned to hide behind professional competence. Actually, I'm not fine, she admitted. I'm scared that I've become someone I don't recognize. Catherine set down her coffee cup, giving Alex the full attention that had made her feel understood throughout her childhood. Tell me what's happening. For the next 2 hours, Alex found herself speaking with a honesty that felt almost foreign after years of strategic communication. She told her mother about Richard's trading violations, about the evidence that could destroy his career, about the choice between justice and revenge that she'd been wrestling with. But more importantly, she talked about the person she'd become in pursuit of that choice. The way she'd manipulated relationships, calculated every interaction, turned herself into a weapon designed for a single purpose. I achieved everything I set out to accomplish, Alex said finally. But I'm not sure the person who achieved it is someone I can live with. Catherine listened with the wisdom that came from raising a daughter, from watching that daughter navigate worlds she'd never entered herself. When Alex finished, her mother was quiet for a long moment. Do you remember when you were 8? Catherine said finally, and Tommy Brennan was bullying you at school. Alex nodded. Tommy had been the kind of kid who'd made elementary school miserable for anyone who was different, anyone who was smart, anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable. You came home crying one day because he'd pushed you down in front of your friends. You wanted to know why some people were mean, why they seemed to enjoy hurting others. I remember. And I told you that hurt people, that Tommy was probably scared and angry about things in his own life, so he was taking it out on you. But I also told you something else. Do you remember what that was? Alex felt tears prick at her eyes as the memory surfaced. You said that the most important choice I'd ever make was whether to let other people's cruelty make me cruel. That's right. And you chose to be kind. You chose to be the person who helped others instead of hurting them. You chose to build instead of tear down. But Richard made his choice when he decided to humiliate you. But that was his choice, not yours. You get to choose who you become in response to that. You always get to choose. They sat in comfortable silence as Alex processed her mother's words. Outside, the neighborhood she'd grown up in was settling into evening quiet. Porch lights coming on, families gathering for dinner, the simple rhythms of lives lived without the complications of corporate warfare. What would you do? Alex asked finally. I'd ask myself what kind of person I want to be, Catherine replied. And then I'd have the courage to become that person, even if it meant letting go of the person I thought I needed to be. The drive back to Manhattan gave Alex time to think about her mother's words, about the choice between justice and revenge, about the person she wanted to be versus the person she'd become. By the time she reached her apartment, she'd made her decision. The next morning, Alex called Richard into her office one final time. He arrived looking haggard, clearly having spent a sleepless night contemplating his future. The confident arrogance that had once defined him was completely gone, replaced by the kind of desperate vulnerability that came from having nowhere left to hide. I've reviewed the compliance evidence, Alex said without preamble. All of Richard's face went pale, but he didn't try to deny or minimize what they both knew she'd found. I'm prepared to offer you a choice, Alex continued. You can resign immediately, make full restitution to affected clients, and leave the financial industry permanently. In return, I won't file criminal charges or report the violations to federal authorities. Richard stared at her in disbelief. Why would you do that? Alex thought about her mother's question, about the person she wanted to be, versus the person she'd become. Because destroying you won't undo what happened 4 years ago. And because I'm tired of being someone whose primary relationship is with revenge. I don't understand. You humiliated me because you thought my background made me less than you. But if I destroy you now, I become exactly the kind of person who uses power to hurt others. I become you. Richard was quiet for a long moment, processing what felt like an impossible reprieve. Thank you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't thank me, Alex replied. Thank the person I'm choosing to become instead of the person you tried to make me. As Richard left her office for the final time, Alex felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the satisfaction of victory, but the quiet contentment that came from choosing growth over destruction, justice over revenge. The game was finally over, and for the first time in 4 years, Alex Morrison felt like herself again. The Sterling & Associates town hall was scheduled for a Thursday morning, with the entire company gathered in the main auditorium and hundreds more employees watching via live stream from satellite offices across the country. Alex had requested the platform to address strategic changes in divisional leadership, but only a handful of people knew the full scope of what she intended to reveal. Standing at the podium, looking out over the sea of faces that represented every level of the company hierarchy, Alex felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about the kind of leader she chose to be, the kind of company culture she wanted to help create. Margaret Thornton sat in the front row, her sharp eyes focused on Alex, with the intensity of someone who'd built an empire by recognizing pivotal moments. Thomas Sterling was beside her, his progressive ideals making him a natural ally for what Alex was about to propose. And there, in the third row, sat Richard Wellington Hayes III, his face pale but composed as he waited for his professional execution. Good morning, Alex began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's acoustics. I want to talk to you today about accountability, about the kind of organization we choose to be, and about the difference between punishment and justice. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the standard corporate presentation they'd expect. 6 months ago, our compliance department uncovered evidence of serious misconduct within our organization. Trading violations that compromised client trust, ethical breaches that undermined our fiduciary responsibilities, and a pattern of behavior that represents everything Sterling & Associates stands against. The auditorium had gone completely silent. Alex could see employees exchanging glances, speculation, and concern visible on faces throughout the crowd. The individual responsible for these violations has been identified, and the evidence is comprehensive. The misconduct included unauthorized trading in client accounts, front-running client orders for personal benefit, and systematic violation of risk management protocols. Alex paused, letting the gravity of the accusations settle over the room. She could see Richard's knuckles white where they gripped his chair, could feel the collective intake of breath as people processed what she was revealing. Under normal circumstances, this kind of misconduct would result in immediate termination, criminal prosecution, and civil litigation. The individual would face federal charges, professional disgrace, and likely imprisonment. Another pause. Alex could see Margaret Thornton leaning forward slightly, her expression unreadable. But today, I want to talk about a different kind of justice, about the choice between destruction and accountability, between revenge and redemption. Alex looked directly at Richard, seeing the confusion and fear in his eyes. The individual responsible for these violations has agreed to resign immediately, make full restitution to affected clients, and leave the financial industry permanently. This agreement serves our clients' interests by ensuring they are made whole, protects our company's reputation by demonstrating our commitment to ethical conduct, and provides accountability without requiring us to become an organization that destroys lives. The silence in the auditorium was profound. Alex could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes trying to process what they were hearing. I want to be clear about something, Alex continued. This decision doesn't minimize the seriousness of the misconduct. Financial crimes hurt real people, pension funds, charitable organizations, individual investors who trusted us with their futures. But our response to misconduct says as much about who we are as an organization as the misconduct itself. She took a breath, preparing for the most difficult part of her presentation. 4 years ago, I was humiliated in a board meeting by a colleague who dismissed my work as public school arithmetic. That humiliation could have defined my career, could have convinced me that I didn't belong in this industry. Instead, it taught me that the best response to discrimination is excellence, that the most powerful answer to cruelty is competence. Alex could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the audience. The story had become part of company lore, though few people knew the full details. I could have used this evidence to destroy the person who humiliated me. Instead, I chose to use it as an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of leadership I want to provide: justice without vengeance, accountability without destruction, the choice to build rather than tear down. Margaret Thornton was nodding almost imperceptibly, her expression suggesting approval of the approach. Going forward, Sterling and Associates will implement new protocols for addressing misconduct. We will prioritize client protection, ensure accountability, and create systems that prevent rather than simply punish ethical violations. We will be an organization that values integrity over revenge, that chooses growth over destruction. Alex looked out over the auditorium one final time, seeing the mix of confusion, admiration, and respect in the faces before her. The individual responsible for these violations is no longer with the company. Client assets have been protected, and full restitution will be made. But more importantly, we have chosen to be the kind of organization that responds to crisis with wisdom rather than anger, that builds trust through our actions rather than our rhetoric. As Alex concluded her presentation, the applause that followed was different from the polite corporate clapping she'd expected. It was genuine, sustained, carrying the kind of respect that couldn't be manufactured. Richard approached her as employees filed out of the auditorium, his face carrying an expression she'd never seen before. Genuine humility mixed with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve the consideration you've You're right," Alex replied. "You don't deserve it, but I deserve to be the kind of person who could show it." Margaret Thornton was the last to leave, pausing beside Alex with an expression of unmistakable approval. "That was masterful," she said. "You turned a potential scandal into a demonstration of organizational values. The board will be impressed." But Alex found that the board's approval mattered less than the sense of peace she felt. For the first time in 4 years, she'd acted not from strategy or calculation, but from the authentic values that her mother had taught her. The game was over. The war was won. But more importantly, Alex Morrison had remembered who she really was beneath all the strategic maneuvering and calculated revenge. She was someone who chose to build rather than destroy, who responded to cruelty with competence, who believed that the best victory was becoming the person you were meant. 6 months after the town hall, Alex sat in her office on a crisp October morning, reviewing quarterly reports that told a story of transformation. Sterling and Associates' new ethics protocols had become an industry model. Client satisfaction scores had reached historic highs, and the company's reputation for integrity had made it the employer of choice for top talent from universities across the country, not just the Ivy League. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Rebecca Foster entered, no longer the uncertain junior analyst Alex had first mentored, but a confident, senior associate whose innovative portfolio strategies had earned recognition from industry publications. "The Morrison Initiative proposals are ready for your review," Rebecca said, settling into the chair across from Alex's desk with the easy confidence of someone who'd found her place in the corporate world. The Morrison Initiative, named by Margaret Thornton over Alex's objections, was a comprehensive program designed to identify and develop talent from non-traditional backgrounds. It included mentorship programs, skills training, and most importantly, a commitment to evaluating potential based on capability rather than pedigree. "How many applications did we receive for the winter cohort?" Alex asked, accepting the folder Rebecca handed her. 437. up from 200 last quarter. Word is spreading that we actually mean it when we say we value diverse perspectives. Alex smiled at the enthusiasm in Rebecca's voice. The young woman had become everything Alex had hoped she could be: brilliant, ethical, and committed to lifting others as she climbed. "Any updates on the Chicago office launch?" Alex asked. Thomas Sterling approved the additional funding this morning. "We'll be able to hire 15 new analysts instead of 10, with a focus on candidates from Midwest universities." The Chicago office was Alex's pet project, designed to prove that financial excellence wasn't limited to Manhattan's elite institutions. She'd personally recruited several department heads from her Ohio State alumni network, creating a pipeline that would give talented students from state universities the same opportunities that had traditionally been reserved for Ivy League graduates. After Rebecca left, Alex found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with David Chen the previous weekend. They'd been walking through Central Park, their relationship rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than strategy, when he'd observed that she seemed different, more relaxed, more genuinely happy than she'd been in years. "You're actually present in conversations now," he'd said with a smile. Instead of calculating 3 moves ahead, the observation had made Alex realize how much of herself she'd lost during her campaign against Richard. The strategic thinking that had made her promotion possible had also made authentic relationships impossible. Learning to be genuine again had been more difficult than mastering complex financial models. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Saw the Wall Street Journal article about the Morrison initiative. So proud of what you're building, sweetheart." The article had been unexpected. A feature story about Sterling and Associates' commitment to diversity and inclusion, with Alex highlighted as an example of how companies could develop talent from non-traditional backgrounds. The reporter had been particularly interested in the contrast between Alex's current approach and the traditional hiring practices that had dominated the industry. What the article hadn't mentioned was the personal cost of Alex's transformation, the relationships she'd damaged while pursuing revenge, the authentic connections she'd sacrificed for strategic advancement, the years of her life spent becoming someone she ultimately didn't want to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.